Jefferson Robbins with NCW Life. History is written by the winners, but there are some parts of history that just don't seem to get written down at all. Here in north central Washington, there's local lore that tells us that sometime around 1875, a group of Chinese miners were brutally murdered near Chelan Falls. But who committed that crime, how many victims lost their lives, or whether it even happened at all, remains a question. Maria Spagna decided to investigate that mystery. She's a resident of Stehekin and author of 9 books of essays, fiction, and poetry. The book that resulted from her search is called Pushed: Miners, a Merchant, and Maybe a Massacre. Maria Spagna, welcome to NCW Life.
Thanks so much. It's good to be here, Jefferson. Yeah.
You and I have talked before. We've first met, I was doing math, it was about 20 years ago, on your first book of memoir and essay. Your background was interesting to me at that time and still is. So what brought you to Stehekin originally?
So I'm actually from Southern California, and when I was a young teenager, maybe 13, I went camping in Oregon and just fell in love with the Northwest. Just the trees, the rivers, the water, everything. I swore I'd come back. I did. I went to college in Oregon, got a degree in English, didn't know what the heck I would do with that, but sort of fell into working for the National Park Service. And at one point, very early on, I was 23 years old, I got a job sight unseen at North Cascades National Park. I had no idea you'd have to take a ferry to get there and everything else. And so I actually talked some roommates of mine in Seattle into driving me over the mountains to drop me off. Couldn't find a place to camp and ended up camping by the, illegally in an orchard by the river, what is now BB Bridge Park, and that ended up being a crucial place in my new book. But that's how I landed. I worked for the Park Service. I kind of landed in Stehekin and stayed, although I've come and gone from there a lot, as you know.
And writing was a background to your life the entire time,
Yes.
even when you were doing other things. This is a pursuit for you.
Absolutely, and I can't recommend that highly enough. That I was doing physical labor, right? It's trail work for all those years. Got laid off in the winter, and so my brain space when I was working, when I was walking, was mulling all those things that then in winter I would have time to write.
We talk about Pushed, the book that's out now, just came out this past year. It's based on, I don't even know if I want to call it legend. It's based on story. Tell us the story as you first heard it.
I just think of it as a story that I heard. I found it in a terrific little book called Wapato Heritage by Tom Hackenmiller, who's a Wenatchee author here. And it had a chapter that told this story, which then I heard over and over in small museums around the region and in history books, which is essentially that they called it the Chelan Falls massacre, and that 300 Chinese miners had been pushed, hence the title, off of a cliff, murdered, and dumped into the Columbia River. The perpetrators, according to the story, were Native people, indigenous people, and that was about it. That was all there was. And I thought, surely 300 people died, there's got to be more than that. And sort of foolishly, ignorantly thought it would be easy to chase down the truth, and it was not. Yeah.
So when you were exploring this a little bit, there were different locations where this might have happened.
Right.
What were some of the possible scenes of the crime?
Well, I would, if people are familiar with the area, I would stand, BB Bridge Park is where the merchant, the Chinese merchant of the title, had a store. So it was almost like a village. There were gardens, and there were stables, and there was a boat launch, and all of that. So standing from there, the story is that it was about a mile from there. Weren't sure about upriver or downriver, thought about some spots, and then it seemed as though maybe up the Chelan River, maybe they weren't dumped into the Columbia, but it's more of a gorge, down into the Chelan River. So that's on one side of the Chelan River. And then another thought is the BB Springs area, which is, a wildlife area now, that's a possibility, but all within view of BB Bridge Park.
What you found out is that this story seemed to arise from one print source originally.
That's correct.
And it made mention of locations, it made mentions of numbers of people, it made mentions of who the perpetrators were, but it gave otherwise very little detail.
Right.
We don't really know time of year when this might have happened.
Nothing.
We don't know exactly if the perpetrators were indigenous. which tribes they might have represented. It left a lot to your imagination, or to the imagination of the person telling the story.
Right, exactly, and trying to parse those pieces together, parse that story and bring those pieces together was the challenge. So one thing that became clear, I think, early on is that early reports said that they were pushed off of a cliff that was 300 feet tall, and then as the story was told, like a game of telephone, that became 300 victims. Now, I think something happened. I think there were a lot of victims. I'm not sure there were 300. I think that was conflated with that number of 300 feet. And otherwise, you know, again, who did it? There are long-standing stories, rumors. People who have relatives who are ancestors who are settlers will say it was white people dressed up as Indians, as indigenous people. Not uncommon in the history of the U.S. I mean, even the Boston Tea Party, they dressed up for various reasons. So that became another story. And then, as you kind of started to allude, it became possible that maybe this writer of the 1891 article for the Spokane Review at the time, maybe he made it up. Maybe there was a reason to make up the story or to repeat a story that floated around, right, and put it in print. But details missing, for sure.
Some things that you did find out, that you make clear that even if this massacre was not a real event, or even if it was an event that was inaccurately described, it's not as if it was unprecedented. There were many, many other mass murders of Chinese in Northwest history.
But that was among the things that really surprised me, that I didn't know. I didn't even know about the history of Chinese folks in our region. They outnumbered white settlers 2 to 1 in the early years, in the late 1800s. So I didn't know about that. There are documented massacres in Los Angeles, in Wyoming, in Eureka, California, in the Dalles, all over our region. In Tacoma, they were pushed out, expelled, pushed off of the docks, and there was a recent opera about that. So these stories are coming to the surface. There was one in Hell's Canyon, Oregon, that a reporter, Greg Noakes from the Oregonian, uncovered and actually found documentation where the men who committed this massacre wrote about it. So I had high hopes that I'd be Greg Noakes and I would find these kind of documents. I have not yet. But there is definitely a long history of violence and oppression of the Chinese in the early history of the Northwest, of our region in particular.
And your title, Pushed, sort of also alludes to social exercises like the Exclusion Acts.
Correct.
Which were designed at the federal level to push Chinese out of the Northwest Territories, push and keep them from coming back in.
Exactly, yeah, and to be clear, the Exclusion Act did not say they all had to leave, but if they left, which they did to go see their families, as immigrants will do, they could not come back in, and then new immigrants were kept from coming in. It was sort of the beginning of those kind of policies in our country. The first time that they tried to control a border, they were controlling the border with Canada so that Chinese wouldn't come in that way. Boats in the Salish Sea, and then and trying to somehow control this border here in eastern Washington as well. But yeah, they were pushed in so many ways. Heavy taxation, even the city of Wenatchee, when it was first being incorporated, they passed a law excluding Chinese people from living in the city. And in one of the hopeful stories or inspiring stories in my research, there was one man, Noah Brown, who stood up at that meeting and said, no, this was unjust, that they shouldn't do it, but they did it anyway. So all kinds of history that I just did not know.
From reading your book, it seems like when you were studying this history and asking people about it, sometimes you got into uncomfortable territory with people. Sometimes people would take a kind of affront at having their version of the history questioned.
Sure, and people hang on to history, right? They hang on to the stories they've been told. A historian friend of mine, Larry Sabula, a bit tongue-in-cheek, he told me early on in my research, he said, well, people love their massacres. I thought, well, what the heck is he talking about? But it's true that there are some stories in the American West of massacres that didn't even happen, but locals believe them for whatever reason they want to believe them, because it characterizes their ancestors in a certain way, or characterizes the settling telling of West in a certain way. They want to believe that happened. And if you think about the Chelan Falls massacre, there are all kinds of reasons to believe what you want to believe. If indigenous people did it, then perhaps that villainizes them. No matter who did it, it can explain why there are no Chinese, or very, very few in our region now. Often when I would be talking to people who know a lot about the history, I'd say, well, what happened to all the Chinese? And they'd say, well, do you know about the massacre? And that's not going to be the whole story, right, no matter what. That you didn't kill them all and push them off of a cliff. But you can see why a story becomes useful in the way you want to understand a history. And I tried really hard, I think you know from reading the book, to honor all of the ways that people tell the story and why they tell it the way that they do.
And you do explore the actual history, the known history of Chinese merchants in this area.
Right.
You uncover people, maybe more than one person, who fit the bill for who was this merchant who had this shop near the scene of the massacre. You also do a lot of traveling. You go from Stehekin all the way up the Okanagan Valley to Chesaw, also named after a Chinese American.
The only town in the United States named after a Chinese American, if you can believe it, tiny Chesaw.
Anna Maria, how did you become interested in doing research into historical events? Because you started off doing personal essays and essays on topics that interested you. So how did it come to you to become kind of a detective in matters like this?
I think you'll remember there was a book early in my career I had heard, it was a similar process to this, that I had heard a rumor about a family story about my dad's involvement in the early civil rights movement in Florida. And I really wanted to find out the truth of that story. And so with no journalistic background, no training like you have, I just dove into it and looked for the people who were involved with him, got to know those people, looked for the story. There were many versions of the story of his involvement of a particular bus boycott in Tallahassee, Florida. And that was so fascinating, to meet these people, to hear their stories, to realize how eager people are to tell their stories, to dig into it and figure out how to tell a story like that. Was so fascinating to me. I'd always loved, narrative nonfiction like John McPhee, or books like, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I love those kind of books, and I like the challenge of trying to put the stories together. I'm also really passionate. A lot of people say, look, you couldn't figure out the truth of this story. Why didn't you write it as historical fiction? And I am just really passionate about the truth. Like, what is the story, and why do we tell stories as, quote, nonfiction the way we do? And so as much as I'm exploring the truth of this story, I'm also really interested in the way the stories are told and being able to try to flesh those out in book form.
You've been teaching writing at various colleges for a number of years now, and this year you're at Wenatchee Valley College.
I am.
So you're splitting your time between here and Stehekin. So what advice do you give your students there on writing well?
I think I tell them first and foremost, like, to write what they're passionate about, right? If you're bored, your readers are going to be bored. Find something that you're interested in. And I think a lot of times they're surprised that if they're interested in car mechanics, why not write about car mechanics, right? If they're interested in horses, write about horses. So that's the first thing. And then to find different ways to tell the story. There's not just one way to tell a story. To use all the tools in your toolbox to make it interesting to you, to make it interesting to the reader. And of course, they're constantly teaching me new things with their approaches and their enthusiasms, and the conversations I have with them, I'm sure, will spur more work.
There's a presentation on Thursday, February 22nd at Wenatchee River Institute in Leavenworth. You'll be there. Your book will be there as the topic of conversation. It's going to be both in person and live stream on YouTube. What do you expect at that event? Will you be doing a reading?
I will read some, and then I've found that visuals with this book are really helpful, so I'll be showing some slides of both the area where the massacre supposedly took place and then some old drawings of Chinese miners, Chinese workers. I think those visuals in this case are really helpful to bringing that history to life. So there will be some slides, some reading, some conversation, hopefully a lively Q&A. There often is when this book is discussed.